Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, April 17th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Trump declined Israeli attack on Iran. So the New York Times reported on Wednesday that President Trump declined an Israeli plan to attack Iran with U.S. support as soon as next month in favor of attempting diplomacy with Tehran. So the report said that Israel developed plans to attack Iran's nuclear facilities that would have required significant U.S. support. The initial Israeli plan would have involved the bombing campaign with Israeli commando raids on Iranian nuclear sites in hopes that American aircraft would be involved. The commando plan would have taken months to prepare, and Netanyahu was looking to attack Iran this May, so next month. So then they shifted the plan to a prolonged bombing campaign, just bombing, no commando raids. And again, the idea is that the U.S. would be involved in the bombing because the U.S. has these 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs and the heavy bombers that Israel does not have. And so the commando, as far as I understand, the commando raid idea would be like like they send them in on helicopters to Israeli nuclear sites. So officials told the New York Times that Trump made the decision to hold off on the attack after months of internal debate within the administration. The rough consensus, at least for now, is that the U.S. should hold off on the military option to pursue negotiations. The report said that Vice President J.D. Vance told the president that he had a unique opportunity to reach a deal with Iran, but he said that if the negotiations failed, Trump could then support the Israeli attack. So the concerning thing here is that there's an Axios report as well that says there's a divide between the administration, with some officials supporting negotiations and others being more skeptical and leaning toward bombing Iran, even though, as we've covered a lot, that the U.S. intelligence agencies, the threat assessment just said there's no evidence Iran is building a nuclear weapon, but they still want to take military action. They want to bomb Iran. They want this war. That's what this is about. So the concerning thing is that this is saying that J.D. Vance is one of the people in the administration cautioning against this, but he's also saying, well, if diplomacy fails, then we could do it. And with all this, there's so many people working against these negotiations that I think, unfortunately, there is a good chance that they could fail. And Vance, of course, in that Signal group chat, he did warn against the idea of bombing Yemen, but then he kind of quickly said, all right. And then he celebrated it, said it was excellent that the U.S. leveled a residential building in Yemen. So, but anyway, this Axios report was kind of interesting, and it discussed the divide between the Trump administration officials, and it's what you would expect. It says J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff favor diplomacy. It also says that Pete Hegseth is on the diplomacy side as well. And this is likely because he's a huge China hawk and wants the U.S. to be more focused on that. But he was totally on board with bombing Yemen. So apparently they're the ones who wanted diplomacy, and then the guys who were against diplomacy, you can guess it was Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz. And Trump is also under pressure from Senators Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton. And I know Lindsey Graham really has Trump's ear. He seems to have a lot of influence over Trump. So Trump has repeatedly threatened to bomb Iran and is currently conducting a major bombing campaign in Yemen. In recent weeks, the U.S. has deployed additional bombers, another aircraft carrier, and other air assets to threaten Iran. And those assets are also being used to ramp up the attacks on Yemen. So it's not just a military buildup. It's a military buildup with a heavy bombing campaign, U.S. bombing campaign happening in the region. Trump showing them that he's not afraid to launch a massive bombing campaign. So it's very threatening. The posture is the point there. And the New York Times report said that in an internal meeting in an administration, a meeting between administration officials, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, presented an intelligence assessment that found the U.S. military buildup in the Middle East could potentially spark a wider conflict with Iran that the United States did not want. So It remains unclear how the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran will go, and I'll get more into this in the next story. But, this report, it's not a surprise that Israel, and they had some details about Netanyahu presenting plans to Trump when he was just recently in the U.S., and it's not a surprise, really, this report. I mean, it was clear that there's deliberations whether or not to bomb Iran or not, and it was clear that Israel was pushing the U.S. to bomb Iran. So, I mean, it's not really surprising to see that these were the discussions, and then Trump decided to go with diplomacy for now. And because that's what's happening. The U.S. and Iran are engaged in negotiations. So we'll get into the negotiations in the next one here. The next story, Iran warns the U.S. against moving the goalposts after Witkoff comment. So Iran on Wednesday warned the U.S. against moving the goalposts after U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff suggested the Trump administration was seeking a deal to eliminate Tehran's civilian nuclear program. Witkoff said in a statement on Tuesday that any deal must eliminate Iran's enrichment program. And that statement came after he suggested that the U.S. would be happy with a deal that limited Iran's nuclear enrichment to 3.67%. And that drew a lot of backlash from the Iran hawks, from the people we mentioned in this report who are against this diplomacy, who they're saying we need a deal to totally dismantle Iran's nuclear program. And the reason why they're saying that is because they want war with Iran. They want to bomb Iran. So this is Iran's foreign ministry spokesman. He said, quote, and again, this is a response to Witkoff backtracking from initially saying, yeah, we'd be happy with the deal that just limits the enrichment, which Iran has been clear that they're willing to go to do that. And then Witkoff saying, no, actually, they must eliminate all nuclear enrichment. So this is the response. The foreign ministry spokesman said, quote, moving the goalposts constitutes a professional foul and an unfair act in football. In diplomacy, any such shifting pushed by hawks who fail to grasp the logic of common sense deal-making could simply risk any overtures falling apart. It could be perceived as lack of seriousness, let alone good faith. We're still in testing mode, end quote. So the language they're saying they're still in testing mode. Iran, they were saying the first round of negotiations was basically to see, okay, is the U.S. serious here? Because they have a lot of reason to think that the U.S. is not serious. And it looked like after those negotiations, they came away with, okay, this could go somewhere. Let's continue. And essentially now the U.S. making these demands are saying it's not a good sign. But negotiations are still going to happen this Saturday. It's not like things are going to fall apart. So where things stand with Iran's nuclear program, they're currently enriching some uranium at 60% and some at 20%. That's still below the 90% needed for weapons grade. And Tehran has made clear it's willing to reduce those levels basically back to the JCPOA levels, which Witkoff mentioned, 3.67%. And the JCPOA is the Iran nuclear deal that Trump withdrew from in 2018. And then I get into some of the threats here. So again, there's some signs here that these negotiations could not go well. And I know I've said this yesterday, but I think it's really important to stress that just about every single Republican in Congress is probably in favor of this diplomacy falling apart and bombing Iran. Maybe not every single one. Maybe there's more that aren't. But just about all of them will go along with killing this diplomacy. And a lot of them will think, oh, we could just bomb Iran or support an Israeli attack on Iran and it won't lead to a major war. But Iran's got some serious missiles that can hit American bases that can cause a lot of American casualties. I just think that's a big factor. The fact that how hawkish Congress is on Iran is kind of a big thing that's at play here. All right, so the next one here, heavy U.S. airstrikes hit Yemen's capital. So the U.S. launched a series of airstrikes against the Yemeni capital of Sana'a on Wednesday, and at least one civilian was reported killed. According to Al Mayadeen, U.S. airstrikes targeted multiple locations in Sana'a and in surrounding areas. Among the targets was a military base in the Al-Hafa area of Sana'a, which was previously targeted during President Biden's year-long bombing campaign in Yemen from January 2024 to January 2025. Yemen's Saba news agency reported that U.S. airstrikes also hit a residential area in Sana'a, and the Yemeni health ministry said that's where the civilian was killed. So U.S. airstrikes on Wednesday also hit other parts of Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is where 80% of Yemenis live. According to Saba, at least 4 strikes hit the Red Sea province of Hodeidah, and U.S. attacks targeted the Jaf province. So another day of very heavy U.S. airstrikes on Yemen. And also on Wednesday, Saudi shelling across the border wounded civilians in northern Yemen. I believe only one. I actually wrote 4 were wounded, but I got to change that. I think it was actually only 1, according to the Yemeni Health Ministry. Since 2022, a ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis has held relatively well, but there has been occasional Saudi attacks across the border. So this happens. This isn't necessarily related to the U.S. bombing campaign or the preparations for a ground offensive. There has been this Saudi shelling across the border, but it could be related at the same time, because the latest violence in Yemen comes amid these reports that the U.S. is considering supporting a ground offensive in Yemen that would be launched by UAE and Saudi-backed forces on the ground. So both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have denied involvement in the plans, but I think there's enough evidence, enough reporting, enough comments from the so-called Yemeni government that's based in Saudi Arabia that there certainly are plans happening here to launch a ground offensive against the Houthis. And I put a quote in here from Eric Sperling. Again, he's the executive director of Just Foreign Policy. And he knows a lot about Yemen. He has a good grip on it. And essentially what he said is that they're denying this because they're afraid of Houthi attacks on their oil infrastructure, on their oil fields, on their oil, these targets that the Houthis got really good at hitting during the war from 2015 to 2022. And that's essentially what made them give up on trying to oust the Houthis. So I think that's why, because they're still backing this so-called Yemeni government and everything. So anyway, but the heavy U.S. bombings continue. I mean, it's just, it's been more than a month now that the U.S. has bombed Yemen. I believe every day. I think at one point I saw Yemeni media say that 24 hours went by that there were no U.S. airstrikes in Yemen, but I still think it's been actually every single day for over a month that the U.S. has bombed Yemen. And I know I say this a lot, but it's just getting such little attention. It seems like just nobody cares. And it's just going on every single day. All right, so the next one here, Israeli drone strikes kill 2 in southern Lebanon. This one is from Jason Ditz. So Israel carried out multiple drone strikes against southern Lebanon again on Wednesday, killing 2 people and wounding another. The death toll of Tuesday's strikes in Ida Run also rose further, with a 17-year-old wounded in that strike passing away, bringing the Tuesday death toll to 2 as well. So Wednesday's attacks focused on vehicles once again, hitting one in the Wadi al-Hujar, an area near the coast, and killing 1 person. A second strike was reported against another car further to the east, killing 1 and wounding another. The casualties have not been conclusively identified, but Israel is claiming that one of them is a top Hezbollah figure, and claiming one was a senior Radwan force commander. Haven't seen any confirmation of that from the Lebanon side. So the Israeli strikes continue, and then Israel Katz, the Israeli defense minister, something he said on Wednesday was that essentially the Israeli troops in Gaza, in southern Syria, in southern Lebanon will occupy those territories indefinitely. And we'll get more into that in this next story here. So the next one here, Israeli defense minister says no humanitarian aid will enter Gaza. So on Wednesday, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said that no humanitarian aid will enter Gaza and vowed that the IDF will occupy the territory it has captured in Gaza indefinitely. Since March 2nd, Israel has imposed a total blockade on aid and all other goods entering Gaza, which constitutes collective punishment of the entire civilian population. Katz said that the blockade was one of Israel's main pressure tools against Hamas. He said in a post on X, quote, Israel's policy is clear. No humanitarian aid will be allowed into Gaza, and preventing humanitarian aid to Gaza is one of the central pressure tools that stops Hamas from using this means against the population. No one under the current reality is going to allow any humanitarian aid into Gaza, and no preparations are being made to allow any aid of this kind, end quote. So one thing, U.S. foreign assistance laws, there's a law that prohibits military aid to any country that blocks humanitarian aid. Obviously, Israel's been doing that all along, but they imposed a total blockade on March 2nd, and now they're openly saying that we're not going to let any in. So the U.S. continues to, so it makes U.S. military aid to Israel illegal. And there's a few reasons why it's illegal, but this is one. And Katz's comments were meant to clarify an earlier statement where he suggested that Israel could allow the distribution of aid through civilian companies. In that statement, he also said IDF troops would not leave the territory they've captured since Israel restarted its genocidal war on March 18th. He said, quote, "The IDF will remain in the security zones as a buffer between the enemy and the communities in any temporary or permanent reality in Gaza, similar to Lebanon and Syria. To date, hundreds of thousands of residents have been evacuated and dozens of % of the territory have been incorporated into these security zones," end quote. He added that in parallel to the Israeli occupation of the territory in Gaza, the plan for the voluntary relocation of Gaza residents is being advanced. And he's referring to ethnic cleansing, the goal of ethnic cleansing, which they frame as voluntary when it's anything but that. So the Israeli military now controls more than 50% of Gaza's territory and is working to turn the entire southern city of Rafah into a buffer zone free of Palestinians. And so, of course, these comments from Katz, will further complicate any negotiations with Hamas, since they've been insisting that they'll release the hostages, but it has to be in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And Katz said that if Hamas continues to refuse to release the hostages under Israel's terms, which now include a demand for the group to disarm, Israeli military operations will expand and move to the next stages. His comments came as aid groups are warning about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza due to the Israeli blockade and the daily slaughter of Palestinians. Doctors Without Borders said on Wednesday that Gaza is turning into a mass grave for Palestinians. The Doctors Without Borders emergency coordinator in Gaza said, quote, "Gaza has been turned into a mass grave of Palestinians and those coming to their assistance. We are witnessing in real time the destruction and forced displacement of the entire population in Gaza. With nowhere safe for Palestinians or those trying to help them, the humanitarian response is severely struggling under the weight of insecurity and critical supplies shortages, leaving people with few, if any, options for accessing care," end quote. All right, so the next one here. Israeli strikes in Gaza kill 22 Palestinians over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said Wednesday that Israeli attacks killed 22 Palestinians over the previous 24 hours as Israeli strikes continue to pound targets across the Strip, and another 3 bodies were recovered from the rubble. The health ministry said that another 89 Palestinians were wounded by Israeli attacks. Among those killed by Israeli attacks on Wednesday was Fatima Hassouneh, a photojournalist. So Israel has killed another journalist in Gaza. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, she was killed along with 10 members of her family by an Israeli strike on a home in Gaza City. The report said more than 210 Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been killed by the Israeli military since October 2023. So this woman slaughtered in a home with her family. And it's just like barely a blip now. Israel kills another journalist. It just barely made the news. Israeli strikes were also reported in southern and central Gaza. Palestinians in the northern city of Beit Lahia held protests against Israel's onslaught. According to Wafa, the Palestinian news agency, the protesters also demonstrated against Hamas, demanding that the group relinquish control over the fate of the people in Gaza. The Wafa report said that during the protest, individuals affiliated with Hamas wearing civilian clothes attempted to infiltrate the crowd and raise pro-Hamas banners. However, the demonstrators resisted and removed the banners, forcing the infiltrators to flee. I saw some videos of that on X as well. So Gaza's health ministry said that since Israel fully resumed its genocidal war on March 18th, 1,652 Palestinians have been killed. So in just under a month, over 1,600 Palestinians killed, just an absolute slaughter. And again, it's just the norm now, just dozens of Palestinians getting killed every day. You see this photo here. This is how kids in Gaza live among the rubble, among the unexploded Israeli shells and the ordnance and everything, and tents. And I didn't add this to the story, but I think it was early Thursday morning in Gaza, another strike on a tent in Gaza burned some Palestinians to death. I mean, just absolutely horrific. All right, so the next one here, Al-Shabaab captures a strategic town in Somalia. So I want to start kind of paying more attention to the situation on the ground in Somalia, because the U.S. is involved in this war and is considering whether or not to escalate or get out of there, basically. We'll get into it. But so Al-Shabaab has captured a town in central Somalia that the U.S.-backed federal government has used as a staging ground for battles in the area. And this was reported by Reuters. The town of Adan Yabal is about 130 miles north of Mogadishu, where the federal government is based. Somali soldiers and residents of this town told Reuters that Al-Shabaab captured it after hours of heavy fighting. So Al-Shabaab has been making gains in its offensive and recently captured villages only 30 miles away from Mogadishu, although they later retreated from those villages. But it really goes to show how they are potentially threatening the capital city. And this offensive has enough momentum that the U.S., which backs the federal government with airstrikes against Al-Shabaab, has been discussing the possibility of shuttering its embassy in Moscow. As I covered recently, that there was a New York Times report saying basically State Department officials actually recommended evacuating the embassy. The idea would be to basically, out of caution, to avoid any sort of rushed evacuation like they did in Afghanistan. But then there's some Trump administration officials, specifically Sebastian Gorka, who's on the National Security Council, super hawkish, especially when it comes to the terror wars. He's saying that the U.S. should escalate and continue propping up this Somali government that's as weak as ever. He's essentially saying, let's just continue this very failed policy that we've been doing in Somalia for multiple U.S. administrations. Trump dramatically escalated the bombing campaign in Somalia in his first term, and he had nothing to show for that. Biden continued it. He didn't bomb Somalia quite as much as Trump. But and again, now it's just he increased aid to the Somali government. He did send U.S. troops back in there, but now you have all these regions withdrawing from the federal government. The government just doesn't have much power, and there's also reports of government troops deciding not to fight. So it's we'll see if the U.S. decides to double down on this failed policy or get out. And now the other thing that's happening in Somalia is this potential for the U.S. recognizing Somaliland, which is in the northwest. And Somaliland, as I understand it, has acted as a de facto independent state for like 30 years. 30 years. And they're not recognized by anybody, but they're looking for recognition from the U.S. They're looking for international recognition, and they're offering their ports to the U.S. military. And where are those ports located? On the Gulf of Aden, right across the water from Yemen. So I think this is an attractive offer for the U.S., and there are reports that the U.S. is really considering it. And of course, there's other things at play here, also rare earth minerals they're saying the U.S. could invest in. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that recognition happening. All right, and they're also still bombing ISIS, the small ISIS affiliate in Puntland, which is in northeast Somalia. All right, the next one, I left up the one from yesterday about Witkoff saying there's progress with talks with Putin. So the last story here, Jewish students slam Trump's detention of Mahdawi. So this article is from Zaytio, from Prem Thacker, and it's about the arrest of Mohsen Mahdawi, the Palestinian American. He was on a green card in the U.S. He's lived in the U.S. for 10 years, student involved in the Columbia protests. It's about his arrest. So anyway, Thacker spoke with Jewish students at Columbia who are just saying it's absolutely absurd for them to be arresting him for anti-Semitism. There's a interview that he did with 60 Minutes where he very strongly condemned anti-Semitism, and I actually saw a video going around at a protest condemning anti-Semitism and saying it has no room in the movement because there's all these Jewish people involved in the movement. So it's just a complete joke that they're trying to portray this as a crackdown on anti-Semitism. So Mahdawi was born and raised in a Palestinian refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. As a child, he watched an Israeli soldier shoot and kill his best friend. After arriving in the U.S. 10 years ago, he went to Lehi University to study computer science before transferring to Columbia to study philosophy. While there, he organized with Palestinian and Jewish students toward peace, served as Columbia's Buddhist Association president, and co-founded the Palestinian Student Union alongside now fellow detained classmate Mahmoud Khalil. This week, Mahdawi was set to possibly turn his green card into full citizenship. Instead, an hour after his appointment time at the immigration office in Vermont, ICE arrived to detain him. And another thing, he was involved in like outreach, like engagement between Palestinians and Israelis. That was something he started to focus on after the protests were real big last year, and then they kind of cooled down. But anyway, so this is who they're targeting and trying to expel. They're just going after people who are critical of Israel. I mean, that's been very obvious from the beginning. But here it's just like so in your face, because if you just look into this guy, you see he's clearly not anti-Semitic. So, and this is interesting that he speaks with a lot of Jewish students here who reaffirm that. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Kelly Vlahos, why let the Houthis bleed our military stockpiles? One from Jacob Hornberger, bomb, Mexico. One from Jeremy R. Hammond, how Trump greenlighted the resumption of Israel's Gaza genocide. One from James Carden, Trump's national security team is a house divided against itself. And the spotlight from Chris Hedges, Israel is about to empty Gaza. So please go check all that out. It was kind of a slow day today, but I think it's good to give our readers a nice small page for once, because things have been just so crazy. So you can support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps out. Another reminder, I'll be taking Easter off this weekend, so there will be no Monday show next week, but I'll tell people again at the beginning of the episode tomorrow, I think. What day is it? Yeah, tomorrow I'll tell them. All right, so anyway, that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.